There is a common assumption that wealthy individuals build and maintain their wealth by following the same investment principles that are often promoted publicly, that they consistently allocate their capital into markets, diversify across assets, and allow compounding to work over time. And while this framework is not incorrect, it is incomplete because it describes only the visible layer of a much more complex system. What is often overlooked is that investing at higher levels of wealth is not just about participation in markets, but about positioning within systems that influence how and when capital is deployed, protected, and scaled. And this creates a structural difference between how the average individual invests and how wealth is actually managed at scale. At the surface level, the advice appears straightforward. Invest consistently, stay diversified, and remain patient. But beneath that surface, wealthy individuals are not simply following these principles in isolation, they are integrating them into a broader framework where liquidity, optionality, and timing play equally important roles. One of the key differences begins with how capital is segmented. For most individuals, available capital is limited, which means that decisions tend to be concentrated. A significant portion of resources is allocated toward long-term investments, often with the expectation that these investments will serve as the primary driver of growth. But for those operating with larger capital bases, the structure is more layered. Capital is not treated as a single pool, but as multiple pools with different functions. Some capital is allocated for long-term growth, some is held for short-term opportunities, and some is reserved specifically for protection and stability. This segmentation changes how investment decisions are made because not all capital is expected to perform the same role. Another important difference is the role of liquidity. In conventional advice, being fully invested is often framed as optimal because idle capital is seen as unproductive. But at higher levels, liquidity is not viewed as inefficiency. It is viewed as optionality. Holding cash or cash-equivalent assets allows for flexibility, enabling capital to be deployed when conditions are favorable rather than being locked into positions that cannot be adjusted easily. This introduces a dynamic where timing, not just time in the market, becomes relevant. And this is not about predicting short-term movements, but about maintaining the ability to respond to changing conditions. There is also the consideration of access. As capital increases, the range of available investment opportunities expands. Certain assets, strategies, and structures are not accessible at smaller scales, either due to minimum capital requirements, regulatory constraints, or network limitations. This means that the investment landscape itself changes as wealth grows, and the strategies that are optimal at one level may not be optimal at another. This creates a divergence between general advice and actual practice, not because the advice is incorrect, but because it is designed for a different context. Another layer involves risk management. For most individuals, risk is often framed in terms of volatility, the fluctuations in asset prices over time. But at higher levels, risk is also evaluated in terms of concentration, liquidity constraints, counterparty exposure, and systemic factors. This leads to a more nuanced approach, where the goal is not simply to maximize returns, but to manage the structure of the system in a way that balances growth with resilience. There is also a difference in how returns are generated. In traditional investing, returns are primarily driven by market performance, by the appreciation of assets over time. But as capital scales, returns can also come from structuring, from how deals are arranged, from how capital is deployed across different layers of a transaction, and from how risk is distributed. This introduces an additional dimension to investing, where outcomes are influenced not just by market behavior, but by the design of the investment itself. Another important factor is time horizon. While long-term investing is a consistent principle across all levels, the way time is used can differ. For individuals building wealth, time is often used to allow compounding to take effect. But for those managing larger systems, time is also used strategically, to enter and exit positions, to structure deals, and to align capital with specific phases of economic cycles. This does not replace long-term thinking, but it adds another layer to how time interacts with capital. There is also a behavioral component that is often understated. Public investment advice tends to emphasize simplicity and consistency, in part because these are the most accessible and sustainable approaches for the majority of people. But at higher levels, behavior is shaped not only by discipline, but by information, experience, and access to different types of decision-making frameworks. This can lead to strategies that appear inconsistent from the outside, but are internally coherent within a more complex system. From a broader perspective, what becomes clear is that the difference is not in whether wealthy individuals invest, but in how investing fits into the larger structure of their financial system. It is one component among many, interacting with liquidity, access, risk management, and strategic positioning. And when these elements are considered together, the idea that the rich invest differently becomes less about specific tactics and more about systemic design. Because at smaller scales, investing is often the system. At larger scales, investing is part of the system. And that distinction changes how decisions are made, how capital is allocated, and how outcomes are ultimately shaped. And when this framework is extended further, another layer begins to emerge, which is how the perception of efficiency shifts as capital grows, because what appears inefficient at one level can become strategically valuable at another. For example, holding a portion of capital in low-yield or non-yielding assets may seem suboptimal when viewed purely through the lens of return maximization, but when viewed within a broader system, that same capital can serve as a stabilizing force, reducing the need to liquidate long-term positions under unfavorable conditions. This reframes the role of capital from being purely productive to being structurally supportive, and in doing so, it changes how performance is evaluated. There is also the concept of sequencing. In traditional frameworks, investment is often treated as a continuous process, where capital is deployed steadily over time. But at higher levels, the sequence in which capital is deployed can matter just as much as the total amount deployed. Entering positions at different points in a cycle or structuring investments to align with specific phases of economic activity can influence outcomes in ways that are not captured by simple models of consistent contribution. This introduces a temporal dimension that is less about predicting exact moments and more about aligning capital with broader structural conditions. Another important dynamic is how losses are managed. At smaller scales, losses are often absorbed directly, reducing the overall portfolio value. But at larger scales, there are mechanisms that can redistribute or mitigate losses, whether through diversification across uncorrelated assets, through contractual structures, or through strategic exits. This does not eliminate risk, but it changes how risk is experienced within the system. There is also an interaction between visibility and strategy. Many of the approaches used at higher levels are not widely visible, not because they are hidden, but because they operate within networks, structures, and contexts that are not part of the public investment narrative. This can create the impression that the same rules apply universally, when in reality, the rules themselves can change depending on the level at which one is operating. And this brings the discussion to a central idea. The difference between how the rich invest and how most people invest is not primarily about knowledge or discipline. It is about structure. It is about how capital is organized, how it is segmented, how it interacts with time, and how it is positioned within a broader system that includes not just markets, but opportunities, constraints, and strategic choices. Because in financial systems, outcomes are not determined solely by what is done with capital, but by how that capital is integrated into a system that evolves over time. And when that system changes, the strategies that operate within it change as well. Ultimately, the idea that wealthy individuals invest differently reflects a deeper reality, which is that they are not simply participating in the same system at a higher scale. They are operating within a system that has different dynamics, different constraints, and different opportunities. And understanding that distinction provides a clearer view of why certain strategies are emphasized publicly, while others remain less visible, not because they are contradictory, but because they belong to different layers of the same financial structure. And within that structure, investing is not just about growth. It is about positioning. It is about maintaining flexibility, managing risk, and aligning capital with a system that is constantly evolving. Because at higher levels, the goal is not just to grow wealth, but to sustain it, adapt it, and integrate it into a system that can continue to function across changing conditions over time. And when this system is observed over an even longer horizon, another dimension becomes visible, which is how stability itself becomes an objective alongside growth, because once a certain scale is reached, the cost of losing ground is no longer symmetrical with the benefit of gaining more. At earlier stages, increasing net worth is the dominant priority, and most decisions are evaluated based on their potential to accelerate that growth. But as capital expands, the focus gradually shifts toward preserving the structure that has already been built, ensuring that it can continue to operate across different economic conditions without requiring constant intervention. This introduces a balancing mechanism between expansion and protection. Capital is no longer pushed entirely toward maximum growth, but is distributed in a way that allows the system to remain functional even under stress, and this often results in allocations that may appear conservative from the outside, but are internally aligned with long-term sustainability. There is also a refinement in how opportunity is evaluated. In early stages, opportunities are often judged based on accessibility and potential return, but at larger scales, they are also evaluated based on how they integrate with existing structures, how they affect liquidity, how they interact with current exposures, and how they influence the overall balance of the system. This creates a filtering effect where not all high-return opportunities are pursued because the objective is not isolated performance, but systemic coherence. Another layer that becomes increasingly important is the coordination between different forms of capital. Financial capital is only one component. There is also informational capital, relational capital, and structural capital, all of which begin to interact in ways that influence outcomes. Access to better information can improve decision quality. Strong networks can provide entry into opportunities that are not widely available. And well-designed structures can enhance efficiency, reduce friction, and optimize how capital flows through the system. These elements are not always visible in traditional investment discussions, but they play a significant role in shaping how wealth is managed at scale. There is also a gradual decoupling between effort and outcome. At smaller scales, outcomes are closely tied to individual actions, to how much is earned, saved, and invested. But as the system matures, outcomes become increasingly influenced by the interaction between existing structures and external conditions, which means that maintaining the system becomes more about alignment than constant input. This does not eliminate the need for active management, but it changes its nature. The role shifts from building to guiding, from accumulating to optimizing. And within that shift, the definition of efficiency evolves. Efficiency is no longer just about maximizing returns, but about minimizing unnecessary risk, preserving flexibility, and ensuring that the system can continue to adapt without disruption. Because in long-duration financial systems, the ability to remain stable through change often has a greater impact than short-term gains. Ultimately, when this additional layer is considered, the idea that wealthy individuals invest differently becomes even clearer. It is not simply that they use different strategies, but that they operate under a different set of constraints and objectives, where growth, protection, flexibility, and integration must all be balanced simultaneously. And within that balance, the role of investing becomes more precise. It is not the sole driver of outcomes, but one component within a larger system that is designed to sustain itself, adapt over time, and continue functioning across a wide range of conditions. Because at that level, the goal is not just to participate in the market. It is to design a system that can endure it.